If you haven't even bothered to learn a native tongue, don't you ever stand up and speak in Afrikaans and talk about how you're the first true African, the first real African, because you had the privilege to stay in the African continent. Do you realize there's no resources, there was no training facilities for Francis Ngannou, for Kamaru Usman and for Israel Adesanya to train at in their native lands? But do you know all three of those kings have built those facilities in the nations that they're from? You don't have to build a facility because the facility is already there. Because guess what? Your facility was built off the wealth and off the backs of the native people who your ancestors stole from. Welcome to the King Mono Show. I truly despise Dricus Du Plessis. And I don't use those words hastily. I know they're very evocative words and some might find them offensive, but I don't like the guy. And I'm going to tell you why I don't like him. And I'd imagine some of the points I raise are going to resonate as to why Africans in general probably do not like this guy.
We go to Africa. As far as I know, it came to America and New Zealand. I'm going to take it out to Africa. I'm the African fighter in the UFC. Myself and Cameron, we breathe the African air. We wake up in Africa every day. We train in Africa. We're African born. We're African raised. We still reside in Africa. We train out of Africa. That's an African champion, and that's who I'll be.
I've worked with many Dricus Du Plessis before, and he's of an ilk of people that smack of not only privilege, but disrespect, racism, and the very worst aspects of human behavior that you hope in a lifetime you don't ever have to encounter. Now, like I said before, welcome to the King Mono Show, and you're probably surprised that I'm talking about this subject, but this is the King Mono Show, and on this channel I really talk about whatever the hell I feel like. And today it happens to be one of my passions that you may or may not know about, which is combat sports. I absolutely love combat sports. I love watching them, particularly boxing and UFC. Those are like really the only two that I watch, I've got to be totally honest with you. And in recent years, we had the privilege of having 3 African UFC champions simultaneously. And having 3 simultaneous UFC champions was an amazing achievement, something that all Africans are very proud of. I, as a Nigerian, was amazingly proud because we had 2 champions, Kamaru Usman at welterweight and Israel Adesanya up at middleweight, and they were not only just champions, they were dominant champions. They were very much phenoms in their weight classes in terms of how often they fought, how long their winning streaks were, and how many times they defended the belt. Francis Ngannou did amazing things. He's Cameroonian, by the way, up at heavyweight. Managed to not only win the title, but defend his belt against all of the best top heavyweights. And he really was going to become quite dominant, but he kind of fell out with the organization. That's a side note. We're not talking about Francis Ngannou and his relationship with Dana White today, although that's something that I might visit in the very near future, given how despicable that whole situation was. Point being, we had 3 simultaneous African champions, and they're all quite, I'm going to say, quite humble in their own right. I know people will say instantly that Israel Adesanya is not humble, but he is in his own right in terms of their achievement as African champions. There's something that all of Africa together could be proud of, these 3 men who, despite their differences in upbringing and despite the many challenges that we Africans have to face, whether or not we're on the continent or in the diaspora, it was something to be proud of. Then along came Dricus Du Plessis, who insists on calling himself an African. And many Africans, for the sake of political correctness, will say, oh, South Africans are African. I'm not one of them. I'm going to be quite frank with you. I don't classify Dutch and British descended South Africans as Africans. And there's many reasons why, which I'm going to touch on in this video. But anyway, back to Dricus. When he managed to start to become a force in the UFC, he's in the same weight class as Israel Adesanya up at middleweight, and he started getting a few wins, starting to get a bit of notice. First of all, no one criticised the fact that he was calling himself an African, as you can't do in these days. It's politically incorrect, so whatever. But the first opportunity he got to basically stamp his mark. He's got a microphone in his hand. Do you have something to say? He says, I look forward to being the first African champion, the first real African champion who's got to take his belt back to Africa, who only trained in Africa, and goes off on this flipping rant about him being the most African of the champions. And this is whilst the three kings, as we call them, Ngannou, Kamaru Usman and Adesanya, were still champions. He showed them no respect, paid them no regard, and basically spat all over their name and said that he was going to be the real champion, the real UFC, the real African UFC champion. It was disgusting. And the reason why it's disgusting is, I mean, you could probably know or formulate these reasons why, but I'm going to list many reasons why, upon hearing this, people like me instantly turned from apathy to hatred, or people who perhaps formerly liked Dricus Du Plessis and wanted him to do well decided, actually now I want you to fail because you are a horrendous human being. So let me list some of the several reasons as to why this approach was awful by Dricus Du Plessis. Reason number one, he could have come in and said, shout out to my fellow African champions, the three kings. I look forward to becoming the fourth king. Maybe I'll have to take the belt away from Israel Adesanya, but I look forward to joining the three kings who have blazed the path. Did he say that? No. Why didn't he say that? Because he's a European descended South African, and they have a particular flavour of arrogance and rudeness that has a complete disregard to their very recent history of hatred and oppression. I think the most frustrating thing about Dricus' whole approach is that he completely discards the entire history of South Africa and the role of the Dutch, the British, the descendants of the modern day Boer nation, and obviously the people who still regard themselves as kind of like British South Africans or whatever in South Africa. Totally disregards it. It's like we don't care about all of that. And I'm not going to give a long history lesson about South Africa, but it's important to note that we're all aware of the fact that the Europeans arrived in South Africa in the mid to late 1600s, or early 1600s, I should say, but really they started to assert their dominance in the late 1600s. So we know for a period of around 200 years, we've had dominance and oppression from the European occupants of South Africa. And many people who are, several generations South African, i.e. several generations have been born there. And I'm very much an advocate of the whole idea that, okay, if you're born in a nation, well, if you migrate to a nation, you're kind of there, but your children who are born into that nation are going to feel more like that nation than what you're going to feel. And then that only amplifies as it goes down the line. So, 6 or 7 generations down the line, if they've been being born in Africa, they're going to feel a need to call themselves Africa. But there's one problem. The big problem as to why Africans have such a hard time welcoming white South Africans with open arms is not because we're racist. It's not because we're exclusivist. It's not because we're xenophobic. It's because, first of all, apartheid only ended in 1994. Literally, I remember that. I was near enough a teen when apartheid ended. And when apartheid ended, literally, instantly, South Africa went from being white-dominated place where black people had no rights, basically lived like dogs within their own nation, were treated absolutely horribly, could be killed in the street without prosecution, went from that to Rainbow Nation. Oh, Rainbow Nation. Oh, it's all the same. Oh, yeah, we're all the same. We're all the same. Typical European maneuverism where we're no longer in power, therefore we want total equality. I'm sorry, but everyone in Africa and everyone outside of Africa and everyone with common sense knows that South Africa needed its period of being a black nation to counterbalance the hundreds of years of it being a white-controlled nation. And it's never had that. In fact, the European occupants of South Africa have never taken on the indigenous languages. They've never assimilated themselves to the culture. So they like to call themselves, oh, I'm African. But you speak English and Afrikaans in Africa. So you're not there speaking the language of the Zulu. You're not there speaking Xhosa. You're not there trying to have conversation with the Bushman in their native tongue. You're not there elevating the people that are there. You're not there trying to assimilate and integrate cultures. You're there treating South Africa like a resort. You're having the best of the crops, the best of the land. You grow up in your privileged upbringing, and let me make this clear. Dricus Du Plessis has a very privileged upbringing.
My dad, my two older brothers, and my mom, we were always pushed to try and be the best that we can be. Because at the end of the day, what you do says a lot about you. I started with judo with my brothers. They were both multiple-time national champions. And then I started wrestling. I always loved martial arts in general and the sport of mixed martial arts.
He was able to train in all of the sports. He was a sporting phenom. What he doesn't realise is that other South Africans, a majority of South Africans, didn't even get the option. They didn't have those access to facilities. You're living in a fairy tale. You're living in a Africa that Africans do not get to experience. You're living in a privilege that was crafted and was funded on the back of African people, African resources and African land. And none of that has caused you to approach this entire topic with sensitivity, because to you, Africans don't deserve sensitivity. To you, Africans don't deserve respect. To you, Africans don't deserve empathy for the treatment that they've been given. To you, hey, well, I'm African, just as African as you. At least I don't leave the nation like you do. Yeah, but that's because you live on a resort. Do you think Francis Ngannou's preference would have been to A, stay in Cameroon, train in a high-quality, air-conditioned facility with some of the best coaches in the world, learn MMA right there and then? Or do you think out of choice he thought, I can do that, but I would much prefer to get in a dinghy, and basically swim from Africa to Europe. I would prefer to risk my life and almost die trying to get to France so I can get out of Cameroon, which I'm living in. Do you think he chose to shovel sand in sand mines for probably pittance to keep his family fed and to be able to fund what became a very successful UFC career? Do you think that was his choice? Do you think he had the options? And yet you're going to come out and you're going to disrespect him. You're going to come out and you're going to disregard the fact that every African can tell you a story like that, and that story either relates to them or something that their parents have gone through or something that their parents' parents has gone through in order for them to be in the position that they're in. I am a privileged African. I am not doubting that one bit. I was born and raised in the UK, and I know that is a massive amount of privilege, but the amount of sacrifice that my mother and her parents had to make in order for my mother to come here, in order for me to get a British education and to have a British upbringing, it was immense. And to think that someone like you will go out who's treated Africa like some kind of resort on your private compounds that normal Africans do not have access to. You look down on them, you've treated them horribly, you're not being funny, but the white-only district still exists in Africa. You spread xenophobia about black Africans like me. That's what the Rainbow Nation, that's what the Europeans are doing with their influence. So they're not using their influence to actually integrate. They want to get their jobs back. They want to get the entire nation back, and then they use all of their influence to spread negative propaganda about other Africans. South Africa's like the only nation where you have that level of xenophobia, where you get black Africans who actually hate other black Africans. And black South Africans, many of them sadly do not know that they're being mind-boggled by the white-controlled South African media. They don't know that they're being taught to hate Nigerians, taught to hate people from the ECOWAS region, taught to hate even some of their neighbouring Africans. because the white media is feeding that to them, because they would prefer to use their position of power to sow seeds of discord and hatred between black South Africans and other Africans than to actually really reconcile, than to really apologize for what they've done and to really actually give back, because they don't want to give back anything. So Dricus's behavior, to me, is just symptomatic of a broader issue when it comes to the behavior of white South Africans. And that's why I despise him. I said earlier that I've worked with a bunch of Dricuses. Well, what does that mean? I mentioned earlier that, and as you know, 1994, the end of apartheid, and that saw a massive reduction. Didn't see the end of it, but it saw a massive reduction in white privilege, particularly when Thabo Mbeki took power after Nelson Mandela. He was a bit more radical, and he managed to put a bit more power and a bit more wealth into the hands of the native black South Africans. Now, during that time, you had many people flee from South Africa. It's amazing. It's like, we're African, but they had no problem running back home to their home nation. It's funny how the Dutch ones remembered that they were Dutch and the English ones remembered they were English, because I know that because they all came flooding back, and I worked with many South Africans in finance positions, and they'd all say the same thing. Oh, you can't get jobs in South Africa. We're being persecuted against. It's amazing. Apartheid ended in 1994, and it didn't even reach 2000, and the whites are complaining about their lack of privilege. They're complaining about, they have no idea what it's like to struggle. They have no idea what it's like for those native people who've been treated like scum within their own nation. They have no idea what it's like to have no access to white privilege. And don't give me all these images, oh, there's poor white South Africans here. Let me tell you something, there is not a nation on this planet where white privilege doesn't exist. Black people, particularly black South Africans, don't have the option of just hopping on a plane and going to another nation where their skin colour will afford them privileges. So all of those white South Africans complaining about poverty in South Africa, just save up for a plane ticket. That's what my parents did. That's what a lot of other African people's parents did, and they found somewhere else. So you save up for a plane ticket. You get off your lazy ass, save up for a plane ticket, and I promise you, your white privilege will pay off. You will find another nation where they will see your skin colour and it will afford you plenty of opportunity. Please do not complain to an African about such things. It's insulting. Don't you ever, especially if you haven't even bothered to learn a native tongue, don't you ever stand up and speak in Afrikaans and talk about how you're the first true African, the first real African, because you had the privilege to stay in the African continent. Do you realise there's no resources, there was no training facilities for Francis Ngannou, for Kamaru Usman and for Israel Adesanya to train at in their native lands? But do you know all three of those kings have built those facilities in the nations that they're from? They've given back. Have you done that? No, because you didn't need to. Your private school funded privileged upbringing was able to ship you out to wherever you needed to, but you stayed in South Africa, and when you take it back, you don't have to build a facility because the facility is already there. Because guess what? Your facility was built off the wealth and off the backs of the native people who your ancestors stole from. They stole from people. They stole from the land. They didn't earn it. Nothing was earned. You could have been humble about this, and you could have had the backing of Africa. I promise you that. I'm not stupid. I know what you get. And I actually appreciate you. I appreciate the fact that you were upfront from the start about what you believed, because then it doesn't leave any illusions to any Africans about the kind of character that you are. I knew it was there. I've yet to meet one that doesn't have that same sense of privilege, that same sense of, if I say I'm African, you have to accept me as an African. I don't accept you as an African, and your behaviour and your attitude has proven that, because the moment you were given a platform, you turned your gun towards Africa. That's what you did, and that's what your ancestors did. The moment you got a position of power to show how African you were, you turned your weapon and you pointed it at other Africans. So doesn't that show how African you are? You are still a colonizer like your parents were, like your grandparents were, and like all of the generations before then. Your attitude is colonization. So, all due respect, you South Africans out there, If you want to welcome Dricus with open arms, oh, he's our brother, oh, South Africa's doing great, oh, Dricus, you go ahead. But me, I know what I'm about, and I know what Dricus is about. Dricus, you are no African, and let me tell you this as well. You will never, ever have the support of Africa. We will never back you. You are a foreigner, you are a colonizer who just happens to have a UFC belt and happens to live on a resort in Africa. And until I see that true repentance, a true understanding of the offence that you've caused Africans in the way that you've spoken, in the offence that you've caused.
Go ahead, my man.
This is a question for Izzy. Culturally, you know, this has been made about culture. We didn't really want to make it about culture, but, you know, someone made it about culture.
Amen.
So here we are. The question for you is, I grew up, you know, my parents were in Nigeria. They obviously moved to a country as well to better themselves. When you win the belt again, do you plan on taking it back to Africa again?
On Tuesday, I'm going back to Nigeria. I think Friday, I'm going to South Africa. And then the next week, I'm going back to New Zealand. I am a child of the earth. I'm a child of the earth. And when I take this bet, I'm taking it everywhere with me.
Thank you, bro. Thank you. Appreciate you.
Question over here.
Are you taking the servants with you when you're going back? Are you taking the servants with you if you're going back?
What the fuck are you even on about?
My God. It's obviously a see and tell. We can see that. What do you mean? You're saying that I made it
shut
about
the fuck
culture?
up. You don't even know anything about my story. You have no idea who the fuck I am.
I don't care about your story. I don't care about your story.
Listen, my father and myself had to wake up at 4 a.m. and clean the banks while my mom studies to be a nurse. You don't know my fucking story.
Amen.
Don't fucking speak of my story if you don't know my story.
I don't care.
I will show you who you are Sunday. So right now, shut the fuck up.
I can't wait.
Back by unless you see.
You're talking about I made it about anything else.
You did.
Being
You
the
did.
first
You couldn't even respect
African
the people of the land.
I am the
Walking
first.
the country. You were the one not even doing anything. I took my shoes off to connect with the people, with the mob. What did you do? You stand there and try to mean mug me. Are you stupid?
My man.
I'm not your fucking man, bitch.
This is my land.
Oh, shit. Just not that. You're going to...
You know, I find it funny that you took the opportunity to point out what you saw, and I've seen this technique done before. I've had people do it to me. Oh, you got to take your servants. You got to take your servants to Africa. You got to do this. It's like by pointing out Africans who are doing well, by pointing out Africans who have managed to achieve wealth, it's like you're trying to create a justification for your crimes. It's like, well, our wealth puts us on a tier. I'm rich, you're rich, we're the same. But no, we've worked for our wealth. Israel Adesanya has worked for his wealth. You didn't. You stole your wealth. Your ancestors stole their wealth. And you might personally have achieved great things. But the fact that you think you can turn and use progress as a weapon against us, almost as though as an African we should feel guilty for achieving something. As Africans we should feel guilty for making wealth. As Africans we should feel guilty for making progress in our lives. Like, it's disgusting. How dare you? It's like with every word you speak, you dig the hole deeper and deeper down. That makes me just say, I hope to God that Israel Adesanya knocks out your front teeth. That's just, I'm just saying, that's how I feel. It might not happen. You know, I'm putting a lot out there. It might come to the weekend and Israel Adesanya might lose and lose horribly. But you know what? It is what it is. It is what it is. I've said what I said. I stand by Israel Adesanya. I hope he smashes Dricus Du Plessis. But more than anything, I hope Dricus, if you or one of your people see this video, maybe you can start to think more carefully about the way you speak. Think about the history of South Africa. Think about your role or your ancestors' role in the way Africa is, not just South Africa, but all of Africa is at the moment. And just speak more carefully. If you truly see yourself as an African and you truly want to be a son of Africa, then try to show Africans respect. It's not that hard. I'm not Cameroonian and I have love for Francis Ngannou. I have love for I have love for every African champion that's ever been and every African champion that will be, but I can't have love for someone like you who the moment you had the opportunity to unify, you could have shown people what it's like to be a white South African. You could have said, here's 3 black native Africans, I'm a white South African, and I'm going to show everybody, I'm going to be like, these are my brothers. And do you know what you could have done for the reputation of white South Africans? Africans would have embraced you. If you had approached Izzy and Kamaru and Francis with love, Africans would have embraced you. They would have been like, this, yes, come, brother. Like, they would have had no choice, but you decided to show hate. You chose hate. That's what you did. You can't put this on Izzy. Yeah, Israel Adesanya might be reacting now, but he's reacting to something that is ancestral and primal within us Africans because of the insult that you've brought to us. So now, anyway, you've shown your hand, you've shown who you are now. I hope that you have some time to reflect. If Izzy does manage to knock your teeth out, I will celebrate and I will rejoice. But if not, I'm just going to send out good luck, Israel Adesanya. I hope you win. Dricus, you know, it is what it is. That's all I'm going to say. Subscribe to the King's Monologue. I can't promise you it's going to be another fight talk in my next video, but I can promise you, you're going to hear it from the heart.